The cold wind the cold wind swept through the bustling streets of Washington, D.C., where people hurried along, their minds occupied with daily routines. The city was alive with the usual rush, honking cabs, the rhythmic steps of pedestrians, and the distant hum of conversations blending together. But among the fast-paced world of politicians, businessmen, and tourists, there was another world, one often ignored, hidden in the shadows of skyscrapers and monuments. Under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, a man sat hunched on the sidewalk, his clothes tattered, his hands calloused from years of hardship. His name was David, a man who once had dreams, a family, and a home. Now, he was just another invisible soul lost in the city's cold indifference. He shivered, pulling his thin jacket tighter around himself, watching as the well-dressed crowds passed him by without a second glance. His stomach ached from hunger. He had gone another day without a proper meal, surviving on scraps and the occasional kindness of strangers. But tonight, he had only received blank stares and hurried steps. He sighed, rubbing his hands together for warmth, knowing that if he didn't find something soon, the night would be unbearably long. Then, he saw a man walking toward him, a figure he vaguely recognized. He squinted, trying to place the face, the tailored suit, the confident stride, the familiar features, and then it clicked. JD Vance, the senator, the man who had once been poor himself. David had read about him, heard his story, a child of a struggling family in Appalachia who had risen to wealth and power. David hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. He had asked countless strangers for help before. Most ignored him. Some scoffed. Others threw a few coins without even looking at him. But something about JD Vance made him want to try one more time. Maybe, just maybe, this man would understand. "Excuse me, sir," David said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Can you give me $1?" JD Vance stopped in his tracks. For a brief second, his face was unreadable. Then, he did something unexpected. Instead of walking away, instead of pulling out a bill or dismissing the man with a polite shake of the head, he crouched down so that he was eye level with David. $1? JD asked, his voice calm but firm. "Why $1?" David was taken aback. Most people either ignored him or gave him something without a word. Rarely did anyone ask why. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Just need something to eat. Anything helps." JD studied him for a moment, his sharp blue eyes scanning David's face, his worn-out clothes, his trembling hands. Then, he reached into his pocket, but not for money. Instead, he pulled out a business card. "I'll do you one better," JD said, handing it to him. "Come to this address tomorrow morning. Ask for me. I'll be there." David frowned, confused. "What's this?" "A job," JD said simply, "if you're willing to take it." David blinked. He had expected pity. Maybe a few coins, but not this. His hands trembled as he stared at the card, reading the address. He looked up, searching JD's face for mockery, for a cruel joke. But there was none. The senator was serious. I don't know if I can," David stammered. "I haven't worked in years. I don't care about your past," JD interrupted. "I care about what you do now. Show up, and we'll see what you can do." David swallowed hard. The offer felt too good to be true. A part of him wanted to believe it. A part of him was terrified to hope. JD stood up, straightened his suit, and looked down at him. "I've been where you are. I know what it's like to feel invisible. But the difference between staying here and moving forward is what you do next." He paused, then added, "See you tomorrow." With that, he walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving David sitting there, staring at the card in his hand. For the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him, something he thought he had lost. Hope. Would he take the chance? Could he? The answer would come with the morning. David sat there for a long time, staring at the card in his hand. The streetlight above him flickered, casting a dim glow over the letters that spelled out an address that could change everything. He traced his fingers over the edges of the card, his mind racing. Could he trust this? Could he trust himself? For years, he had lived in the shadows of the city, surviving on scraps and kindness that was few and far between. He had seen promises made and broken. He had learned that hope could be dangerous, that it could lift a man up just high enough to let him crash even harder. And yet, something about the way JD Vance had looked at him, something about the certainty in his voice, made David consider the impossible. He stuffed the card deep into his pocket and pulled his jacket tighter around himself. The cold was relentless, but tonight it didn't seem to bite as hard. Morning came too soon. The sun crept over the horizon, casting long shadows on the empty streets. David woke up to the distant sound of car horns and the chatter of early risers heading to work. His back ached from sleeping against the cold pavement, and his stomach grumbled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten. He reached into his pocket and felt the card, the address, the chance. For a moment, doubt tried to take hold. What if they turned him away? What if this was all just some empty gesture, meant to ease a guilty conscience? What if he walked into that place only to be laughed out the door? But then he heard JD's words in his head. I've been where you are. The difference between staying here and moving forward is what you do next. David pushed himself to his feet. His legs felt weak, but he started walking anyway. The address led him to a brick building in a part of the city he hadn't stepped foot in for years. It wasn't flashy. Just a simple office tucked between a cafe and a bookstore. He hesitated at the door, staring at the name on the glass. He took a deep breath. Then he stepped inside. The warmth hit him first. It was the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in a long time, not just from the heat in the room, but from the way the people inside looked at him. Not with pity, not with disgust, just acknowledgement. A woman at the front desk looked up and smiled. "Can I help you?" David swallowed hard. His voice was hoarse, but he forced himself to speak. I'm supposed to meet JD Vance." He pulled the card from his pocket, as if to prove he wasn't making this up. The woman nodded. "You must be David. He's expecting you." David's heart pounded. He was expecting him. Before he could process that, she stood and motioned for him to follow. She led him down a short hallway to a door that was slightly ajar. She knocked lightly. "Come in," a familiar voice said. David stepped inside. JD Vance sat behind a desk, dressed in a crisp white shirt with his sleeves rolled up. He wasn't surrounded by cameras or political staff. He was just a man, sitting there like he had been waiting for this moment. David shifted nervously. You actually meant it." JD gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." David did. His hands gripped the arms of the chair like he was bracing for something. JD leaned forward. "Tell me your story." David hesitated. No one had asked him that in years. Most people just assumed, filling in the blanks with their own ideas of what a homeless man's life must have been like. But JD was asking, and he was listening. So David told him about the job he lost, the apartment he couldn't afford, the family that drifted away, the nights he spent wondering where he had gone wrong. JD didn't interrupt. He didn't look at him with pity. He just listened. When David finished, there was silence. Then JD leaned back in his chair and nodded. "All right, let's get to work." David blinked. "Work?" "You wanted $1, JD said. I'm offering you a way to make 100. David swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can." JD cut him off. "Yes, you can, but you have to want it." David looked down at his hands. He was afraid of failing, afraid of believing in something again. But he was also tired of the cold, tired of being invisible, tired of feeling like his life was already over. JD stood and held out his hand. David stared at it for a moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and shook it, and just like that, everything changed. JD's handshake was firm, steady, like an anchor pulling David back into reality. It had been a long time since someone had looked at him like he was capable of something, rather than a problem to be ignored. JD motioned toward the door. Come. With me. David hesitated but stood. His legs still felt uncertain beneath him, but he followed JD out of the office and down another hallway. They stepped into a large room that looked like a workspace. Desks, computers, people moving around, with purpose. I run several initiatives, JD said as they walked. Some are political, some are business-related. But I also work with organizations that help people get back on their feet, real jobs, real opportunities. David swallowed. And you think I belong here? JD stopped and turned to face him. I think you belong wherever you decide to be. David looked around. He saw men and women working, some in suits, some in jeans and t-shirts. Some of them looked polished, others rough around the edges. But they all had something in common. They were here. They were doing something. JD gestured toward a man sorting through paperwork at a desk. See him? That's Marcus. 2 years ago, he was sleeping in his car. David's eyes widened. JD pointed to a woman organizing files, near the back. That's Gina. Single mother. Was barely making it before she started here. David turned back to JD, his throat tight. And me? JD smiled faintly. That's up to you. David wanted to believe this was real. That this wasn't just some momentary gesture that would disappear by tomorrow. But he had nothing left to lose. JD led him to a smaller office in the back. A man in his 50s sat behind a desk, glasses perched on the end of his nose, flipping through a stack of papers. He looked up and raised an eyebrow at JD. This is David, JD said. He's looking for a shot. The man nodded, setting his papers down. We all were at some point. He leaned forward. You got any experience? David hesitated. Depends on what you need. The man studied him for a moment, then smirked. Good answer. He pulled out a form and slid it across the desk. Let's start here. David stared at the paper. It was just a simple form. Name, background, basic information. But to him, it felt like a door. A door he never thought he'd have the chance to open again. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the pen. He wasn't sure what his future looked like. He didn't know if he'd succeed. But for the first time in a long time, he was ready to try. JD clapped him on the shoulder. Welcome back. And just like that, a man who had been invisible for years finally felt seen. David's grip tightened around the pen. It had been years since he'd filled out any kind of official paperwork. The last time he had written his name on a form, he was applying for an apartment, one he had lost only months later. His fingers hovered over the first line, full name. He swallowed hard and forced himself to write, David Allen Carter. The man behind the desk, whose nameplate read Frank Sullivan, watched him with a quiet patience. Take your time, he said. David nodded, moving to the next question. Previous employment. His stomach twisted. The last real job he'd had was at a construction company, nearly 7 years ago. He had been a foreman, overseeing a crew, making decent money. Then the company downsized. Layoffs hit, and he was one of the casualties. He had done odd jobs since then, fixing things for cash, helping at a mechanic's shop when they needed an extra hand, but nothing steady, nothing that had lasted. JD, standing nearby, seemed to sense his hesitation. Put down what you can, he said. We're not looking for perfection, just honesty. David exhaled slowly and wrote, Construction. Foreman, 2014 to 2018. When he reached the section that asked for a home address, his hand froze. Frank leaned forward slightly. You can leave that blank for now. We'll figure something out. David nodded, relieved. He finished the form as best he could and slid it across the desk. Frank scanned it, then looked up. All right, he said. We'll start you off with something simple. We have a warehouse a few blocks from here that needs some extra hands. Sorting inventory, lifting boxes, organizing shipments. You up for that? David blinked. You mean, today? Frank smirked. You wanted a shot, didn't you? David glanced at JD, who gave him an encouraging nod. He felt his heart pounding. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was real. A chance to work, a chance to prove, to himself, more than anyone else, that he could still do this. "I'm in," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. Frank stood and reached for a set of keys. "Good. I'll drive you over." David followed him out of the office, still feeling like he was caught in some kind of dream. JD walked with them to the front door. "You show up, you work hard, and you don't quit," JD said. "That's all we ask." David swallowed, then nodded. "I won't let you down." JD's expression softened. "Don't do this for me. Do it for yourself." David stepped outside, feeling the crisp morning air on his face. For the first time in years, he wasn't just watching the world move past him. He was stepping back into it. The drive to the warehouse was quiet at first. David sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the city passed him by. It was strange to see the streets from this perspective, inside a car rather than from the sidewalk. Frank, hands steady on the wheel, glanced at him. "Been a while since you worked?" David nodded. "Yeah." Frank didn't push. He simply nodded, as if he understood. The warehouse was in a more industrial part of the city, tucked between loading docks and shipping hubs. When they pulled up, David took a deep breath. The building was massive, with metal roll-up doors and forklifts moving in and out. Workers in high-visibility vests walked around, some directing trucks, others carrying boxes. Frank parked and turned to him. "All right, here's the deal. This is a temp spot for now. Show up, do the work, and if you prove yourself, we'll talk about something permanent." David clenched his hands. "I can do that." Frank nodded approvingly and led him inside. The inside of the warehouse smelled like sawdust and cardboard. The hum of machinery filled the air. A man in a dark blue jacket, bald with a thick beard, walked up to them. "This is Mike," Frank said. "He's the shift supervisor." Mike looked David up and down, his expression unreadable. Then he extended a hand. "You ready to work?" David shook it firmly. "Yes, sir." Mike grinned. "All right then, let's get you started." He led David to the back of the warehouse, where stacks of boxes were piled high. Some needed to be sorted, others loaded onto pallets. It was physical labor, demanding and repetitive. But David didn't mind. In fact, as soon as he started, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: purpose. The hours passed in a blur. Sweat dripped down his back as he lifted, sorted, and moved. His muscles burned from the effort, but he didn't stop. He didn't slow down. Every time he felt his body protest, he reminded himself why he was here. JD Vance had given him a shot. Now it was on him to prove he could take it. When the shift ended, David wiped his brow and looked up, realizing for the first time that it was dark outside. Mike clapped him on the shoulder. "Not bad for your first day." David exhaled heavily. "Thanks. You coming back tomorrow?" David didn't hesitate. "Yeah, I'll be here." Mike smirked. "Good. We'll see if you can keep up." David watched as the other workers grabbed their things and headed out. Some got into cars, others onto buses. He realized he had no idea where he was going. To sleep that night. As if reading his mind, Frank walked up. "You got a place to stay?" David hesitated. "Not really." Frank rubbed his chin. "All right. We got a program for that too. Temporary housing for guys getting back on their feet. I can make a call." David's chest tightened. He had expected a job. But this? This was more than he had dared to hope. His voice caught. He cleared his throat. "That would be... Yeah. That would be good." Frank nodded. "Come on then. Let's get you set up." As they walked to the car, David glanced up at the night sky. For the first time in years, he wasn't dreading tomorrow.